Back in 2019, around the time that I started this channel, this particular scenario looked very feasible, something that might happen within my lifetime. I was actually considering the possibility of spending the last years of my life on another planet. But as time has gone on and Starship development has begun to drag a bit, and the barriers to Starship development have become more and more apparent, this moment where 1,000 starships, or however many that Elon Musk plans to build, transports tens of thousands of people to Mars until eventually we have a colony of 1 million people. This scenario seems far off in the future, at least a century, perhaps longer, but that is not how Elon feels about it. Predictably, his feelings are still extremely optimistic. In his most recent interview with Time magazine, he stated that he would be surprised if mankind was not on Mars in 5 years, presumably the first expeditionary mission, but nevertheless, 5 years between now and mankind landing on Mars. Is this just another example of Elon time, or is this something that could theoretically take place? If the first manned expedition to Mars can be accomplished within 5 years, then this particular scenario looks a lot more doable within a couple of decades or perhaps 30 years, a time frame that could theoretically fall within my natural lifetime. But is this just too much to hope for? What are the barriers to our first journey to Mars, and are they something that could be overcome in a mere 5 years? Well, believe it or not, I think that they could be overcome. That it is possible that the first manned starship could make the journey to Mars successfully and actually return. And yes, I do believe that the first manned mission to Mars should have a return mission involved, although it doesn't necessarily have to. And although the technological and scientific barriers to such an expedition seem innumerable, really there are only two, well, actually three major barriers as far as I'm concerned that we have yet to really determine can be overcome. Only 2 or 3, and the reason I'm saying that is because there are 2 barriers that are actually related barriers that are part of the same problem. That's about it. And although these problems may be few in number, they are extremely difficult problems, perhaps insurmountable at least within a 5-year time frame, perhaps much longer than that. And actually the fact that these barriers have not been identified, at least by the general public, as being huge barriers bothers me quite a bit, because until these problems are overcome, our future on Mars is in jeopardy, at least if we're going to be using Starship without any other vessel to support it. And that is something that needs to be addressed. And we're gonna do that right now. When people talk about a manned expedition to Mars, one of the most common things that is discussed is the fact that it is such a hostile environment. There's no air, it's so incredibly cold, there's all this radiation, etc., etc. However, the Artemis mission intends to establish a permanent manned presence in a place that is far, far more hostile than Mars. The temperatures on Mars, for example, are far warmer in in spite of the thin atmosphere and in spite of the distance from the sun, if we're talking about an equatorial location, Mars drops down to about 60 or 70 degrees Celsius below zero. And although that may seem like quite a bit, during the 2-week time frame that the moon remains completely shaded from the sun, the temperature can drop down as low as 230 degrees Celsius below zero, a massive difference of nearly 200 degrees. And the reasons for this are obvious. Even though Mars has an incredibly thin atmosphere, it's sufficiently thick to retain heat. Also, Mars has a 24-hour day. It is not a tidally locked world as the moon is. So that being the case, it doesn't have a 2-week night, and it also has an atmosphere that can retain heat. No matter how thin that atmosphere may be, it makes a colossal difference, which means the life support issues for any habitat on Mars are going to be much easier to maintain than life support on the moon. On top of that, Mars has far more abundant water than the moon does, which is an absolute necessity to create your own atmosphere, obviously to provide yourself with drinking water, and also to grow produce. The basic necessities of survival on Mars are far more abundant than they are on the moon. So once we've learned how to survive on the moon, we can definitely survive on Mars. As far as I'm concerned, once we get to Mars, actually surviving there is going to be relatively simple. It's the trip there that is the biggest barrier, which is what Elon Musk has been saying all along. So here's major barrier number 1, and this barrier has actually been clearly identified by Elon and talked about a hell of a lot in most of his interviews about Mars, and that is reusability. Starship must be a reusable vessel if we are going to make the journey to Mars, because Starship needs to be refueled in low Earth orbit by multiple tanker starships, and in my opinion, it's going to have to be completely refueled, not just 4 or 5 tankers with 100 tons worth of fuel each. That isn't going to be enough to do the job, in spite of what SpaceX might have to say, and I'll explain why that's the case a little bit later on. And reusability is something that has not been proven with Starship, or indeed even tested yet. We haven't done a single hop with the same Starship prototype yet. I was hoping that we were going to do it with SN15, or at least attempt it, but that is not going to be the case. And when Elon says that rapid reusability is an absolute essential, he is right. And so far, we don't know if Raptor engines are going to be reusable, how many times they can be reused, or if the rest of the ship is going to stand up to one use after another. It is more complicated than the Falcon 9 boosters that we reuse, although it is a very solid ship produced out of stainless steel. There are a lot of other factors that are unknowns. For example, what about the heat shield? Thus far, the heat tiles that SpaceX has been testing, and they've been testing a variety of them, are extremely resilient when we're talking about heat, but they have a nasty habit of becoming detached, and that's just under a normal flight situation up to 10,000 meters. What happens when they go all the way to orbit, and then the ship has to re-enter? Assuming the heat shield even survives that complete experience, is it going to be solid and reliable for another use without an extreme amount of work to make sure that all of the tiles are still in good shape? That is a big unanswered question right now, because it is a fundamentally different system than what we used on the space shuttle. How rapidly can Starship be turned around from landing and taking off? Is it going to be 24 hours or even less than that, as Elon has assured us, or is it going to be weeks or perhaps even months? The turnaround time for Falcon 9 boosters has proven to be extremely short, just a couple of weeks at this point. But Falcon 9 boosters are not Starships. Falcon 9 boosters don't have to go through the fiery inferno of re-entry. They don't have to go all the way to orbit. It's a completely different and far less challenging problem than bringing Starship back down and reusing it. So I have some issues as to whether or not the reusability of Starship is going to live up to its original design intentions. That being the case, the second issue could prove to be a lot more challenging than we've been thinking thus far, and that, of course, is low Earth orbit refueling. And here's where the challenge of the reusability factor comes into play. You can't leave a Starship in orbit indefinitely and hope for the fuel to survive the experience. Propellant boil-off will take out approximately 1% of the ship's fuel per month. Now, that may not sound like a great deal, but if Starship stays in orbit for months or years, that means you're losing fuel as fast as you're putting it into the ship. So you're going to need to have vessels that can be reused rapidly, or you're going to need 12 or 13 Starships on ice that can be quickly brought into service and launched. First of all, 12 or 13 Starships would be incredibly expensive, but the problem aside from that is, where do you keep these Starships at Cape Canaveral or at Boca Chica? How quickly can you prep them? How quickly can you carry out the static fires and pre-flight checks before you launch them? So many things that have to be done with a Starship before you can launch it. Just keeping 12 or 13 of them on hand in close proximity to a launch pad is practically impossible. And that's just one of the many problems. Aside from that, you also have the fuel slosh issue. This is a problem that I've talked about in the past. Liquids do not behave the same in microgravity as they behave here on Earth. But even on Earth, liquid methane tanks on liquid methane tankers are kept either completely full or completely empty, because this fluid has a tendency to slosh around. The more it sloshes around, the more unstable the ship. The more unstable the ship, the more difficult it is to carry out a refueling maneuver. On top of that, fluids simply don't behave the same way in microgravity as I just said. Bubbles, for example, in fluid and microgravity do not rise to the surface. They stay suspended in the fluid, and any bubbles would create clogs in any refueling pipes. So any sort of refueling process is going to have to somehow deal with these challenges if it's going to be successful. And thus far, we haven't tested this sort of technology at all, aside from a simple process of transferring a few gallons of water from a refueling tank to the ISS water tanks. That's it. So there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to fuel slosh, when it comes to propellant getting clogged in the system, and many other challenges with low Earth orbit refueling. How difficult are these things going to prove to be? And also, are we going to be able to launch Starships quickly enough in order to make up for the propellant boil-off that's going to exist in Earth orbit? Granted, you can deal with all these problems with a fuel depot, but it's highly unlikely that we're going to be able to design and construct and launch a fuel depot in 5 years. And that's what this video is about: getting a manned Starship to Mars in 5 years. Now, once Starship is fully fueled, and once again, I'm going to get to why that's necessary, and on its way, there are, of course, other challenges, like a massive solar flare or solar mass ejection. That would prove to be dangerous to the crew. However, a solar shelter should take care of any of those kinds of issues. Life support is something that's going to have to be designed and perfected by then, but since we've been able to maintain humans on the ISS for sustained periods of time, I see no reason why Starship and its huge cargo capacity shouldn't be able to hold, say, around 10 human beings for a 6-month trip without any real problems. The food, the water, the necessary atmosphere, especially if it's being recycled, none of these things represent a serious issue. It's when you're approaching Mars and trying to land that is Starship's biggest challenge. Landing on Mars at all is a massive challenge. Indeed, the difficulties of landing on the Red Planet have led to the destruction of quite a number of our probes over the years, and the challenges are simple but very difficult to overcome. Mars' atmosphere is incredibly thin. Therefore, using the atmosphere to slow down, to decelerate so you don't have to use as much fuel, is not a method that is nearly as reliable as using the same principle on Earth. As a matter of fact, it's 100 times more difficult because the Martian atmosphere is only 1% that of Earth. It's actually substantially less than that. Consequently, terminal velocity on Mars is 1,000 kilometers per hour, as opposed to approximately 200 kilometers per hour on Earth for a skydiver who has his arms out and is doing his best to reduce his speed. Starship, utilizing its flaps and fins, would be no different. Its terminal velocity would be at least 800 kilometers per hour, and that's being very generous in my opinion. And it's what I've frequently called the SpaceX Starship Suicide Dive. Now, I have some serious questions about this simulation from SpaceX. First of all, how the hell does it loop up from 5 kilometers to 10 kilometers without using the engines? That's simply impossible, and we haven't seen Starship do that in any of its tests thus far. Now, the drop from 10 kilometers to about 2 kilometers is close to accurate, a little over 600 kilometers per hour, but once it hits 2 kilometers, at that point, it really needs to be hitting its engines. However, it's not designed to. My question is, how does it decelerate from 600 kilometers per hour when it's 2 kilometers up to the velocity that it supposedly has at this stage? There is a theory out there, and I have it linked in the description, that the speed of any object is going to drop substantially once you hit that 2 kilometer mark, that the density of Mars' atmosphere increases radically at that point. And so if you use that abruptly dense atmosphere to slow you down radically during the final 2 kilometers, then you only really need to use the engines during the last few hundred meters of the descent, or so the argument goes. Here's the problem. We haven't seen that theory in practice during any of our attempted landings on Mars. Instead, we've seen completely the opposite. Perseverance and also Curiosity have both had to use braking thrusters and parachutes and a sky crane just to land 1 ton successfully on the surface of Mars. 1 ton. So what in the name of God makes us think that we are going to be able to land 100 tons of Starship and 100 tons worth of cargo at minimum utilizing very small fins and flaps, as opposed to, say, an aircraft trying to land or something, which, by the way, also couldn't be done on Mars given how thin the atmosphere is? What makes us think that something is going to be able to aerodynamically decelerate to that extent. Personally, I think it's not going to decelerate it much at all. And this is not because I'm an aerodynamic expert. It's because of what I've observed thus far with all of the Starship tests in Earth's atmosphere, which is 100 times as dense. As you can see, the clock is at about 4.5 minutes when Starship begins to make its descent from 10,000 meters. It is utilizing its flaps and fins in order to maneuver itself back to the landing pad, which it does with great efficiency and precision. Extremely impressive, but look how fast it descends from 10 kilometers to the point to when its engines have to cut in just a few hundred meters above the surface of the planet. We've just passed a little bit more than 1 minute, okay? So we're talking 10 kilometers in just over a minute, and it's just about to cut in its engines here in a moment, and here we go. 90 seconds to go from 10 kilometers to less than 1, and that's in an atmosphere that's 100 times as dense as Mars. What makes us think that the aerodynamic qualities of Starship are going to allow this vessel to descend any slower or even just as slow as it does on Earth? And by the way, the engines cutting in when they did barely landed SN-15 safely. If it had been traveling at 600 to 800 kilometers per hour and the engines had cut in at the same point, Starship might have been able to have just enough time to perform its flip turn before it disintegrated on impact. It would have been a magnificent sight and a magnificent failure, and that is precisely what we can expect to happen on Mars time and again until we resolve this issue. And the only way to resolve it, in my opinion, given that we don't have a sky crane, we don't have parachutes, all we have is braking thrusters, we need a lot more fuel, and we need the engines to engage when Starship is several kilometers above the surface of Mars, not a few hundred meters. And that is why Starship needs to be completely refueled before it begins its journey, because we need enough fuel in reserve to make a powered landing rather than trying to use this aerodynamic approach that frankly just doesn't work. I mean, we've seen the evidence time and again with every test thus far, and there's no reason to believe that it's going to be any better on Mars. As a matter of fact, it's going to be 100 times worse. And here's another complication. If you leave a lot more fuel in the tanks for a landing, but you don't have the tanks completely full, the fuel slosh issue is going to be a serious problem, especially when you try to carry out your flip turn. It's going to make the whole craft completely unstable, but there is a simple solution to this problem. All you have to do is make the header tanks bigger for both the methane and the liquid oxygen, and reserve that fuel exclusively for landing. If those tanks are completely full when you carry out your flip turn, there's going to be very little fuel slosh and the craft will be far more stable, which is an important factor if you have human beings on board. So it is a complicated issue. The whole Starship Suicide Dive has been a problem that I've talked about many times, but the simplest solution, especially if we want to land in 5 years, is simply to completely refuel Starship and have larger header tanks for a powered landing. That should solve the issue. And the good news is, once we do land on Mars, the first mission should be fairly straightforward. We won't need habitats. You have 1,000 cubic meters worth of space on Starship, and that will be more than enough space for a crew of 10 to stay for a 2-year mission. And even though growing food is going to be an absolute essential if we're talking about a permanent presence on Mars, you won't need it for a 2-year mission. A single human being would only require 400 kilograms worth of food for 2 years. So you're talking 4 metric metric tons for a crew of 10 for the entire mission. Maybe 5 metric tons if you want to plan for the worst. So really, you don't need a tremendous amount in order to be able to survive. The water would be a great deal of mass, but keep in mind, water can be recycled quite efficiently at this point, with almost 93% efficiency in this day and age. So really, you're not going to need a hell of a lot of water at all. And this is, of course, assuming that we cannot purify and desalinate the water ice that's already on Mars, which we probably can. This is also assuming that we can't set up aeroponics or hydroponics or aquaponics on Mars to grow our own food, which we probably can. All of these barriers are very solvable. As a matter of fact, prototypes for habitats and aeroponics and hydroponics to be used on Mars, all sorts of things when we're talking about long-term habitation on the red planet have already been built and tested here on Earth. That is not the major problem. The major problem is simply getting there and landing there successfully. Those are the major barriers. The rest of the barriers can be overcome with technology that we understand and are going to involve a substantial financial investment, but that's about the extent of it. And also, if we're talking about the distance and the ability to resupply this colony, well, contrary to popular belief, there is not just one launch window every 2 years that we have to take advantage of. There are, in fact, 2 launch windows. One is the conventional method going from Earth to Mars. The other method is a Venusian flyby utilizing Venus's gravity to increase the speed of an unmanned cargo starship going to Mars when it's on the opposite side of the sun. This scenario is nearly as fast as the conventional method and would allow cargo starships to resupply the colony in emergency situations that require that we use a different launch window. And hundreds and hundreds of tons worth of supplies can be delivered to colonists in a fairly short order. I mean, we're not talking 2 years here or anything like that, should it be necessary, including all of the solar panels that are going to be necessary to manufacture the fuel to come back. All of these problems are things that we can overcome. The major ones that we don't fully understand yet are the ones that I have mentioned in this video, and until those are overcome, all of this remains science fiction. If you like what I have to talk about, if you enjoy these types of topics and want to see more, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, and there are more benefits coming to Patreon supporters every day. And by the way, as I'm recording this conclusion, I'm getting ready to head to a convention at Las Vegas where I'm going to be looking over the Sierra Space Pavilion and a mock-up of the Dream Chaser. If you want to support this trip that I'm taking, that also is in the description, either through PayPal or Patreon, or just a like and subscribe, and I will be very grateful. So until this moment becomes reality, until SpaceX figures out how to overcome these significant technological challenges and delivers the human race to Mars for the first time, hopefully in 5 years. I truly hope that that is possible. I urge all of you to stay angry about space.